Good evening, friends. Tonight we journey back to ancient Greece, where philosophers pondered existence while common folk scraped by on barley bread and watered wine. We'll walk through Athens at dawn, when the agora fills with merchants and the Acropolis catches first light, discovering how ordinary Greeks survived without running water, proper medicine, or any notion of personal privacy. If these quiet explorations through history help you drift away, consider tapping like and subscribe, and down in the comments, let me know where you're listening from tonight and what hour shows on your clock. It never ceases to amaze me how this peaceful community stretches across every time zone. So lower your screen brightness, adjust your blankets just right, let your breathing slow, and allow the marble dust of ancient Athens to settle as we step together into a world both brilliant and brutal. Imagine yourself stirring awake in Athens, around 430 BC, not in some grand marble temple or philosopher's garden, but in a modest dwelling tucked into the maze of narrow streets below the Acropolis. The first sensation isn't the warmth of sunlight through your window, because you likely don't have one. Instead, it's the ache spreading through your lower back from the thin straw pallet that served as your bed. The Greeks called it a klein, if you were fortunate enough to own a proper wooden frame, but for most ordinary Athenians, sleep meant a simple mat of woven reeds placed directly on the packed earth floor. Your home, if we can call it that, consists of perhaps 2 rooms, maybe 3 if your family has managed some modest success in trade or craftsmanship. The walls are made of sun-dried mud bricks, held together with a mixture of clay and straw. In winter, these walls offer little protection from the damp cold that seeps in from the Aegean. In summer, they trap the Mediterranean heat like an oven. As consciousness fully returns, you become aware of the sounds that define every Athenian morning. The roosters have been crowing for some time now, their calls echoing across the tightly packed neighborhood. Through the thin walls, you hear your neighbors beginning their day. The scrape of pottery, the crying of infants, the low murmur of morning prayers to household gods. The air in your dwelling is thick with the smell of last night's olive oil lamp, that slightly rancid, smoky scent that clings to everything. Mixed with it comes the unmistakable odor from the street outside, human waste, animal dung, and the general decay of organic matter that accumulates when thousands of people live pressed together without any real system of sanitation. You see, ancient Athens had no sewers to speak of, no underground network of pipes to whisk away the unpleasant realities of human existence. Instead, most households kept a clay pot called an amos in the corner of their living space. When full, its contents would be carried out and dumped in designated areas outside the city walls, or sometimes, when no one was looking, simply tossed into the street. Rising from your pallet requires careful navigation in the pre-dawn darkness. Windows, when they existed at all, were small openings high in the wall, covered with oiled cloth or thin sheets of marble if you could afford it. Glass windows wouldn't become common for centuries yet. Most homes remained dim even during daylight hours, forcing residents to conduct much of their lives in the public spaces outside. Your morning routine begins with the most basic human needs. There's no bathroom, of course, no running water, no privacy. If you're lucky, your neighborhood might have a public latrine, a long bench with holes cut into it, positioned over a trench. You'd sit there, shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, conducting your business while perhaps discussing the upcoming assembly or the price of grain. The Greeks had a peculiar relationship with bodily functions. They weren't particularly squeamish about them, viewing them as natural parts of life. Yet they also understood the connection between filth and disease, even if they couldn't explain it scientifically. They used small pieces of pottery called pessoi, or sometimes sponges on sticks for cleaning themselves, though these communal sponges, shared among many users and rinsed in vinegar or salt water between uses, were hardly hygienic by any standard. Water for washing comes from the public fountain. Every morning, the women and slaves of Athens would make their way through the streets carrying large ceramic vessels called hydriae. These fountains, fed by underground pipes from mountain springs, were social centers as much as practical necessities. Here, while waiting in line, people exchanged gossip, arranged marriages, and conducted the informal business that kept the city running. But let's say you're a free male citizen, not a woman or slave. Your morning water needs might be attended to by others in your household. Still, the water that arrives is precious and must be used sparingly. A small basin for washing your face and hands, perhaps enough to rinse your mouth. The idea of a full bath is a luxury reserved for special occasions or visits to the public baths. Now, as the first rays of sunlight begin to pierce through the narrow streets, it's time for the morning meal, or what passes for one. The typical Athenian breakfast, if you could call it that, consists of barley bread dipped in unmixed wine. The bread is hard, coarse, often days old, made from barley because wheat is expensive and usually reserved for special occasions. You break off a chunk of this bread, so dense it could practically serve as a building material, and dip it in wine to soften it. The wine isn't the refined vintage you might imagine when thinking of ancient Greece. It's rough, acidic, probably already beginning to turn to vinegar. The Greeks actually considered drinking unmixed wine to be barbaric and dangerous, but in the morning, this small amount serves as both sustenance and mild antiseptic for the mouth. If your family is doing relatively well, there might be some olive oil to drizzle on the bread, perhaps a few olives themselves, preserved in brine, maybe a small piece of cheese made from goat's milk, though it's likely hard and salty, designed more for preservation than taste. Fresh fruit is seasonal and expensive. Meat is almost entirely absent from daily meals, reserved for religious festivals when animals are sacrificed and the flesh distributed among citizens. The monotony of this diet cannot be overstated. Day after day, month after month, the same barley bread, the same olives, the same watered wine. Malnutrition was common, especially among the poor. Dental problems were rampant from the grit in poorly milled flour. Life expectancy hovered around 35 years, though this number is skewed by high infant mortality. As you finish your meager breakfast, you prepare for the day's labor, and labor it most certainly will be. Unless you're among the small percentage of wealthy citizens who can afford to live off the work of others, survival in ancient Athens means constant physical work. Perhaps you're a potter, heading to your workshop in the Kerameikos district. Your hands are already permanently stained with clay, your fingernails cracked from the constant exposure to water and earth. You'll spend the next 12 hours hunched over a wheel, shaping vessels that might sell for a few obols if you're lucky. The workshop is hot, dusty, filled with the acrid smoke from the kiln. Or maybe you're a stoneworker, trudging toward the quarries on Mount Pentelicus, the marble that will one day inspire countless artists and architects doesn't leap from the ground fully formed. It must be hewn from the living rock with bronze tools and human muscle. The work is dangerous, crushing injuries are common, and the fine marble dust that fills the air slowly destroys the lungs of those who breathe it year after year. Agricultural workers have it no easier. If you own a small plot of land outside the city walls, you rise even earlier to make the journey to your fields. The soil of Attica is thin and poor, requiring constant attention to produce even modest yields. You'll spend your day bent double under the Mediterranean sun, pulling weeds, hauling water, fighting a constant battle against the rocky ground that seems to grow more stones than crops. But let's say you're one of the more fortunate free citizens, perhaps a merchant or skilled craftsman with a workshop in the agora. Even your life is far from comfortable by any modern standard. You navigate streets that are narrow, crooked, and perpetually filthy. There's no municipal cleaning service, no one whose job it is to remove the accumulating waste. The streets themselves are hazardous. Unpaved except for the main thoroughfares, they turn to rivers of mud when it rains. In dry weather, they're dusty channels filled with obstacles, broken pottery, animal droppings, pools of stagnant water where mosquitoes breed. Buildings encroach from both sides, their upper stories sometimes nearly touching across the narrow space, blocking out sunlight and trapping fetid air. Disease is a constant companion in these conditions. The Greeks recognized the symptoms of various illnesses but have little understanding of their causes. They speak of bad air or miasma rising from swamps and filth, not entirely wrong, though they don't understand the role of bacteria and viruses. When illness strikes, and it frequently does, the options are limited. There are physicians, followers of Hippocrates, who at least attempt systematic observation and treatment, but their tools are primitive: bloodletting, purgatives, prayers to Asclepius, the god of healing. More often than not, a serious illness means death. The most feared diseases are those that spread rapidly through the crowded city. The plague that struck Athens in 430 BCE, just as you're living through this day, killed perhaps a quarter of the population. Thucydides, who survived it, described the symptoms in horrible detail: fever, inflammation, violent coughing, vomiting, pustules covering the body. The dead accumulated faster than they could be properly buried, and the social fabric of the city began to tear. Even in times without plague, everyday ailments take their toll. Dental abscesses without antibiotics, broken bones that heal crooked if they heal at all, hernias from heavy labor that can't be properly repaired. Women face the additional peril of childbirth without modern medicine, with perhaps 1 in 5 dying from complications. As you make your way through the city this morning, you're constantly reminded of your place in the social hierarchy. If you're a citizen, and only about 10% of the population holds this status, you have certain rights and responsibilities. You can own land, participate in the assembly, serve on juries. But citizenship comes with obligations too: military service when called, participation in religious festivals, and the constant political maneuvering that characterizes Athenian democracy. If you're not a citizen, your position is far more precarious. Medics, foreign residents, can engage in trade and crafts but can never own land. They pay special taxes and have no political voice. Women, even citizen women, are legally equivalent to children, unable to own property or participate in public life. They spend most of their lives confined to the women's quarters of their homes, venturing out only for religious festivals or family emergencies. And then there are the slaves, perhaps a third of Athens' population. Their morning began even earlier than yours, preparing your breakfast, hauling your water, tending to countless tasks that keep the household functioning. Some slaves, particularly those with skills, might be treated relatively well. Others, especially those in the silver mines at Laurion, face conditions so brutal that death is often a mercy. The psychological weight of this stratified society presses down on everyone. Citizens fear losing their status through debt or political disgrace. Medics hope to gain acceptance while knowing it will never fully come. Women navigate the narrow spaces allowed to them, their intelligence and capabilities constrained by social custom. Slaves dream of freedom while knowing that even if manumitted, they'll never be truly free in Athens. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, the city becomes increasingly crowded and chaotic. The agora fills with people conducting business, arguing politics, shopping for necessities. The noise is overwhelming. Merchants hawking their wares, animals bellowing, hammers ringing on metal, wheels creaking on stone. There's no escape from this sensory assault. No quiet parks, no private spaces where you can find a moment's peace. Privacy, as we understand it, simply doesn't exist in ancient Athens. Your neighbors know your business, your quarrels, your intimate moments. The walls are thin, the living space is cramped, and much of life necessarily takes place in public view. Even relieving yourself, as we mentioned, is often a communal activity. The gymnasium, where citizens exercise naked, offers no privacy. The baths, when you can afford them, are crowded social spaces where personal space is unknown. Your body, your functions, your daily struggles are all visible to those around you. This lack of privacy extends to your thoughts and beliefs as well. Athens may pride itself on being the birthplace of philosophy and free thought, but there are definite limits. The trial and execution of Socrates, which will happen in about 30 years from this morning we're experiencing, demonstrates the dangers of thinking too freely. Question the gods, challenge social norms too directly, and you might find yourself facing charges of impiety or corrupting the youth. The morning is also filled with religious obligations that cannot be ignored. Before any important task, you must make offerings to the appropriate gods. A splash of wine poured on the ground, a small cake left at a household shrine, prayers muttered under your breath. These aren't empty rituals, but genuine attempts to placate forces that seem to control every aspect of life. The gods of Athens are not distant, benevolent beings. They're capricious, jealous, quick to anger. Fail to honor them properly, and disaster might strike. Your crops might fail, your ship might sink, your child might sicken. The anxiety of maintaining proper relations with dozens of deities adds another layer of stress to daily existence. Consider the simple act of leaving your house this morning. You must be careful not to step out with your left foot first. That would invite misfortune. If you encounter certain birds or hear certain words, you might need to return home and start again. A sneeze at the wrong moment could cancel important plans. These superstitions aren't quaint folklore, but serious concerns that govern behavior. The mental burden of navigating all these rules, hierarchies, and dangers is exhausting. Modern life has its stresses, certainly, but we don't generally worry that forgetting a prayer might cause our business to fail, or that a political rival might bring charges that result in our exile or execution. As the morning wears on and the heat begins to build, the smells of the city intensify. The fish market adds its particular pungency to the mix. Day-old catch baking in the sun, attracting clouds of flies. The tanneries contribute their nose-searing chemical stench. The metalworkers' quarter fills the air with smoke and the acrid smell of hot metal. Your clothing offers little protection from these assaults on the senses. If you're a typical working-class Athenian, you wear a simple tunic called a chiton, made of rough wool or linen. It's probably the only garment you own, washed infrequently because water is precious and the process is laborious. In summer, it's stifling, in winter, inadequate. Footwear, if you have any, consists of simple sandals made of leather or woven reeds. Many people go barefoot, their soles hardened by years of walking on rough stones. The streets punish soft feet. Sharp pottery shards, thorns, hot stones in summer, cold mud in winter. The state of your feet becomes a constant preoccupation. Cuts and scrapes are not minor inconveniences but potential death sentences. Without antibiotics, even a small wound can become infected, leading to blood poisoning that spreads through your body. You've seen it happen to neighbors. A simple stumble, a cut from a broken pot, and within days they're burning with fever, their foot swollen and streaked with red lines creeping up the leg. By mid-morning, the heat is becoming oppressive. Athens in summer is a furnace, with temperatures regularly exceeding what we'd measure as 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The narrow streets trap the heat, creating corridors of stifling air. There's no escape to air-conditioned buildings, no cool drinks readily available. Water, when you can get it, is warm and often questionable in quality. The human body's response to this heat adds another layer to the city's complex odor. Deodorant doesn't exist. Bathing is infrequent. The gymnasiums where citizens exercise are filled with the sharp smell of sweat mixed with the olive oil that athletes rub on their bodies. This oil, scraped off with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, is sometimes collected and sold for its supposed medicinal properties. Imagine that, purchasing someone else's scraped-off sweat and dirt as medicine. If you're engaged in physical labor, which most Athenians are, the heat makes every task exponentially harder. The blacksmith's forge becomes unbearable. The baker's oven turns his workshop into a torture chamber. Even merchants in the agora struggle to stay conscious through the worst of the afternoon heat. Heat exhaustion claims victims regularly, especially among the elderly and those already weakened by poor nutrition. Water becomes an obsession. The public fountains have long lines by mid-morning, and tensions run high. Fights break out over queue jumping or perceived slights. The water itself, remember, comes through clay pipes that are often cracked, allowing contamination to seep in. Waterborne diseases spread rapidly, especially in summer when the supply runs lower and becomes more concentrated with whatever impurities it carries. The social dynamics at these water fountains reveal the complex web of relationships that govern Athenian life. Women and slaves, who do most of the water carrying, must navigate carefully. A slave who accidentally splashes a citizen might face a beating. A woman who lingers too long in conversation might damage her reputation. The fountain house is one of the few places where different social classes must interact, and the tension is palpable. Let's say you need to purchase something from the agora. The marketplace is a maze of temporary stalls and permanent shops, selling everything from imported perfume to locally made pottery. But commerce here is nothing like the straightforward transactions we're accustomed to. There are no fixed prices. Everything must be haggled over, every transaction a small battle of wits and wills. The currency itself is problematic. Silver coins, when you have them, must be carefully examined. Counterfeiting is common, and accepting a bad coin could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Many transactions happen through barter or credit, creating complex webs of obligation that can entangle families for generations. Food shopping is particularly fraught. Without refrigeration, everything must be bought fresh daily if you can afford it. But fresh is a relative term. Meat, when available, is often on the edge of spoilage. Fish, unless you're at the market at dawn, has been sitting in the heat for hours. Vegetables wilt, fruit ferments, grain develops mold that won't be discovered until it's ground into flour. The constant specter of hunger haunts most Athenians. Even in good years, the margin between subsistence and starvation is thin. Attica cannot produce enough grain to feed its population, making the city dependent on imports from the Black Sea region. When these shipments are delayed by weather or war, prices spike and people go hungry. During times of scarcity, the sight of people foraging for edible plants becomes common. Boiled grasses, acorns ground into a bitter flour, even leather boiled to extract whatever nutrition it might contain. The elderly and the very young are the first to succumb when famine strikes. Their bodies simply cannot withstand the stress of prolonged malnutrition. The psychological impact of this constant food insecurity cannot be understated. Every meal might be your last good one for weeks. Every harvest is watched with anxiety. Will there be enough? Will it last until the next growing season? This uncertainty breeds a mentality of scarcity that affects every aspect of life. Social obligations add another layer of complexity to survival. As a citizen, you're expected to contribute to public festivals, religious ceremonies, and military campaigns. These contributions, called liturgies, can be financially ruinous. You might be required to outfit a worship, fund a dramatic performance, or provide a public feast. Refusing isn't really an option. It would mark you as a bad citizen, inviting social ostracism and political retribution. The democracy that Athens is so proud of is, in practice, exhausting for ordinary citizens. The assembly meets frequently, sometimes multiple times per month. Attendance is expected, and while there's a small payment for participation, it barely covers the loss of a day's work. You sit on hard stone benches under the blazing sun, listening to speakers drone on about matters that might seem abstract. Foreign policy, trade agreements, military expeditions, but that could result in taxes that bankrupt you or wars that claim your life. The legal system is even more demanding. If you're selected for jury duty, which happens by lot, you might spend days listening to complex cases. There are no professional lawyers. Citizens must prosecute and defend themselves. If you're accused of a crime, you must stand before hundreds of your fellow citizens and argue for your innocence. The stakes are often life or death. Many crimes carry the penalty of execution or exile. Even being a witness to someone else's legal troubles is dangerous. Sycophants, professional accusers who make their living by bringing lawsuits, prowl the city looking for any violation they can prosecute. Did your neighbor fail to properly register a slave? Did a merchant use false weights? Did someone speak carelessly about the gods? These informants collect rewards for successful prosecutions, creating an atmosphere of perpetual suspicion. As noon approaches, those who can afford it seek shade and rest during the heat of the day. But for most workers, there's no such luxury. The construction sites where temples and public buildings slowly rise don't stop for comfort. Workers haul massive stone blocks up wooden ramps, their bodies straining against ropes, their backs breaking under the load. Accidents are common. A slipped rope, a shifted stone, and a man is crushed in an instant. The silver mines at Laurion, which provide Athens with much of its wealth, operate continuously. Slaves work in tunnels barely tall enough to crawl through, breathing air thick with dust and smoke from oil lamps. The temperature underground can exceed 100 degrees. Many don't survive a year. Their bodies, when they finally fail, are dumped in mass graves, unmourned and unremembered. Even skilled craftsmen face dangers. Potters develop lung diseases from clay dust. Tanners handle chemicals that burn skin and destroy nasal passages. Metalworkers suffer from lead poisoning, their minds slowly deteriorating from exposure to toxic fumes. There's no workers' compensation, no disability support. When your body fails, you beg or starve. The afternoon brings new challenges. If you're fortunate enough to have business in the agora that doesn't involve heavy labor, you still must navigate the complex social dynamics of Athenian public life. Every interaction is loaded with potential danger. Show too much deference to someone of lower status and you lose face. show insufficient respect to someone more powerful, and you make an enemy. The concept of honor or time governs these interactions. Your reputation is everything. A single misstep, a perceived slight, a failure to reciprocate a favor, an ill-considered word, can destroy your standing in the community. And without social standing, you're vulnerable to every predator in the city. Political factions add another layer of danger. Athens is divided between various groups: oligarchs who want rule by the wealthy, radical democrats who push for even greater equality, and various personalities who command loyal followings. Aligning with the wrong faction at the wrong time can result in ostracism, a 10-year exile from the city, or worse. The physical infrastructure of the city reflects these tensions. There are no police in the modern sense. Order is maintained by a small force of Scythian slaves owned by the state, but they're mainly concerned with keeping order in the assembly and courts. In the streets, you're largely on your own. Theft is common, violence frequent. The strong prey on the weak with impunity unless the victim has powerful friends willing to seek revenge. As the afternoon wears on, fatigue becomes overwhelming. You've been up since before dawn, you've worked continuously in oppressive heat, you've had little to eat and only warm, questionable water to drink. Your body aches from labor, your eyes burn from dust and smoke, your head pounds from dehydration. But the day is far from over. If you're a woman, your day has been no easier, though different. Confined largely to your home, you've been managing household slaves if you have them, or doing all the household work yourself if you don't. Grinding grain by hand is back-breaking labor that must be done daily. Spinning thread and weaving cloth for the family's clothing is endless. Preparing meals with primitive equipment over an open fire in a poorly ventilated room leaves you coughing from smoke. The isolation of women's lives carries its own psychological burden. Cut off from public life, forbidden from participating in the intellectual and political discussions that animate the city, many women exist in a kind of living death. They're valued primarily as producers of legitimate children, their own desires and capabilities irrelevant. Depression and anxiety, though not recognized as such, manifest in various physical ailments that physicians attribute to the wandering womb or other female hysteria. As the shadows begin to lengthen across the narrow streets of Athens, you realize that this morning, this difficult, exhausting, dangerous morning, is simply one of thousands you'll endure if you're lucky enough to survive. The bronze sun disk continues its arc across the sky, indifferent to the struggles below. Soon, evening will bring its own challenges. The return journey home through darkening streets, another meager meal of the same bread and olives, the preparation for tomorrow's identical routine. You've navigated another morning in ancient Athens, where every small comfort we take for granted, clean water, adequate food, basic medicine, personal safety, remains a distant dream. The marble temples gleaming on the Acropolis might inspire poets and philosophers for millennia to come, but down here in the streets where real Athenians live and work and struggle, life is an endless cycle of labor, uncertainty, and survival. The scent of smoke from 1,000 cooking fires begins to rise as households prepare their evening meals, and you know that tomorrow, if the gods permit you to wake again, this same harsh rhythm will resume. The city that gave birth to democracy demands everything from its people, their bodies, their time, their health, offering in return only the slim possibility of seeing another difficult dawn. As we drift from the crowded streets of Athens, let's journey southwest across the Peloponnese to Sparta, a city that would seem alien even to other Greeks. Here, in the valley of the Eurotas River, surrounded by mountains that isolate it from the rest of the world, a different kind of Greek civilization developed. one that would produce King Leonidas and the 300 warriors who would face the Persian Empire at a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae. To understand what happened at that pass in 480 BCE, we must first understand what kind of men stood there. And to understand these men, we need to go back to their childhood, or what the Spartans allowed them to have of childhood. Imagine being 7 years old in ancient Sparta. Not 17, 7. This is the age when boys were taken from their mothers and enrolled in the agoge, the Spartan education system. Though education is perhaps too gentle a word for what awaited these children, it was systematic brutalization designed to create perfect soldiers, and it began before you were old enough to fully understand what was happening to you. Actually, the selection process began even earlier. When a Spartan baby was born, it was brought before the elders. They examined the infant carefully, looking for any sign of weakness or deformity. If the child was deemed unfit, it was taken to a cliff on Mount Taygetos called the Apothetei, the place of rejection, and left there to die from exposure. The Greeks had a term for this, brephos apothesis, the exposure of infants. The lucky ones died quickly from the cold. But let's say you passed this first test. You spent your first 7 years with your mother, though even this early childhood was far from soft. Spartan mothers were famous for their harsh discipline. They bathed babies in wine to test their constitution. If the child went into convulsions, it was considered weak. They deliberately underfed their children to accustom them to hunger. They left them alone in the dark to eliminate fear. When the day came for you to enter the agoge, your mother didn't weep or cling to you. Spartan women were raised to show no emotion at separation. She might have said something like what Spartan mothers supposedly told their sons before battle, "With your shield or on it," meaning return victorious or dead. There was no third option in Sparta. The agoge barracks where you now lived were deliberately uncomfortable. You slept on beds of reeds that you had to gather yourself from the Eurotas River, breaking them by hand since you weren't allowed a knife. In winter, you might add thistledown for warmth, but blankets were forbidden. The cold was supposed to make you tough. Many boys developed chronic respiratory problems that plagued them for their short lives. Your clothing consisted of a single cloak, worn year-round. No shoes, regardless of weather or terrain. Your feet would eventually become like leather, but the process of toughening them involved months of pain. Split skin, infections, frostbite in winter. Some boys lost toes. This was considered acceptable wastage in the creation of soldiers. Food was deliberately insufficient, not just simple or monotonous like in Athens, but calculatedly inadequate. The boys were kept in a constant state of hunger, forced to forage and steal to supplement their meager rations. But here was the cruel twist: if you were caught stealing, you were severely beaten. Not for stealing itself, which was encouraged, but for the incompetence of being caught. The famous story of the Spartan boy who hid a stolen fox under his cloak and let it gnaw through his stomach rather than reveal his theft. Whether true or not, it illustrates the values being instilled. Pain was nothing. Death was nothing. Shame was everything. Physical training dominated every day. Running, jumping, wrestling, weapons training. But this wasn't the athletic cultivation practiced in other Greek cities. This was preparation for the specific type of warfare Sparta practiced, hoplite combat. Hours spent holding heavy shields in formation. Endless drills moving in perfect synchronization. Any mistake earned a beating. The beatings were constant and creative. Older boys were encouraged to discipline younger ones. Instructors carried whips and used them liberally. There was an annual ceremony called the diamastagosis, where boys were flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Some died from the whipping. This was considered an honor for their families. But physical brutalization was only part of the program. The agoge also involved systematic psychological conditioning. Boys were taught to speak only when necessary, and then in the briefest possible manner. The word laconic comes from Laconia, the region around Sparta. When Philip of Macedon threatened, "If I invade Laconia, I will raze Sparta to the ground," the Spartans replied with a single word, "if." They were taught to suppress all emotion. Crying was forbidden, even for young children. Showing pain, fear, or distress brought shame not just on you, but on your entire mess group. These groups, called syssitia, became your primary loyalty. You ate together, trained together, suffered together. The bonds formed were intended to be stronger than family. Sexual relationships between older and younger males were not just tolerated but institutionalized. An older youth, usually in his 20s, would take a younger boy, perhaps 12 or 13, as his beloved. This wasn't seen as abuse but as educational. The older partner was supposed to model proper Spartan behavior. The emotional and psychological impact of these relationships on young boys, particularly those who didn't conform to expectations, can only be imagined. At 20, if you survived the agoge, you became a full soldier. But the harsh conditions didn't end. You continued to live in barracks, eating in your mess hall, training constantly. Marriage was permitted, but almost irrelevant. You visited your wife secretly at night, returning to barracks before dawn. Some men had children before they ever saw their wife's face in daylight. Even meals in the mess hall were exercises in deprivation. The famous Spartan black broth, a concoction of pork, blood, vinegar, and salt, was legendarily awful. A visitor from Sybaris, a city known for luxury, after tasting it said, "Now I understand why Spartans don't fear death." Meals were eaten in silence, quickly, without pleasure. Food was fuel, nothing more. This was the system that produced Leonidas and his 300. Men who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt as perfect instruments of war. Men who knew no trade but combat, no art but killing, no philosophy but obedience to Sparta. Leonidas himself was somewhat unusual among Spartan kings. He hadn't been expected to rule. He was the third son of King Anaxandridas II. But his older brothers died, and he found himself on one of Sparta's two thrones around 489 BCE. Yes, Sparta had two kings simultaneously, a peculiar arrangement that often led to conflict, but also prevented any single person from gaining too much power. By 480 BCE, when the Persian Empire turned its attention to Greece, Leonidas was about 60 years old, an advanced age for any warrior, especially one raised in the Spartan system. His body would have been a map of scars, his joints arthritic from decades of combat training, his breathing perhaps labored from old injuries to his ribs. The threat from Persia had been building for years. The Ionian Greek cities in Asia Minor had revolted against Persian rule in 499 BCE, with support from Athens. The revolt failed, but it brought Greek affairs to the attention of the Persian king Darius. His first invasion in 490 BCE was defeated at Marathon, but everyone knew the Persians would return. When Xerxes, Darius's son, began assembling his invasion force, the numbers were staggering. Ancient sources claim millions of soldiers, though modern historians suggest perhaps 200,000 to 300,000. Still, this was the largest army the Greeks had ever seen. It took 7 days and nights for the entire force to cross the Hellespont into Europe. The Greek response was fragmented, as usual. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful cities, had radically different strategies. Athens, with its powerful navy, wanted to fight at sea. Sparta, supreme on land, preferred to make a stand at the Isthmus of Corinth, abandoning everything north of the Peloponnese. The decision to defend at Thermopylae was a compromise. The narrow pass between the mountains and the sea was one of the few places where a small force might hold off a larger one, but it was also north of the isthmus, requiring Sparta to commit forces to defend territory that wasn't their own. The Spartan force that marched to Thermopylae was deliberately small. 300 full Spartan citizens, accompanied by their helots, slaves who served as light infantry and support troops. The number of helots isn't recorded, but there were probably several thousand. Other Greek cities contributed forces too: Thespians, Thebans, various Peloponnesian allies. The total Greek force was perhaps 7,000 men. Why so few? The official reason was religious. The Carnea festival was happening, and Spartan law forbade military campaigns during religious observances, but there were political calculations too. Sparta couldn't afford to lose its entire army far from home. The 300 were essentially a suicide mission, buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare. The selection of the 300 was careful. Leonidas chose men who had living sons, ensuring their family lines would continue. These weren't young glory seekers, but mature warriors who understood exactly what they were being asked to do. They performed the death rituals before leaving Sparta, essentially attending their own funerals. The march to Thermopylae took several days. Imagine these men, products of the Agoge, walking north through Greece. They knew they wouldn't return. Their wives knew. Their children knew. Yet they walked steadily, maintaining the disciplined pace that Spartan armies were famous for. No hesitation, no looking back. Thermopylae itself, the name means hot gates from the thermal springs in the area, was a narrow strip of land between steep mountains and the sea. At its narrowest point, perhaps 50 feet wide, a stone wall, built long ago and partially ruined, ran across the pass. The Spartans spent their first days repairing this wall, a mundane task that must have seemed almost absurd given what was coming. When the Persian army arrived, the sight must have been overwhelming even for these hardened warriors. The Persian camp stretched for miles. The dust cloud from their march could be seen long before the army itself. The noise, hundreds of thousands of men, horses, camels, supply wagons, would have been audible as a constant rumble. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, waited 4 days before attacking, expecting the Greeks to flee when they saw his army. When they didn't, he sent a messenger offering terms. If the Greeks surrendered their arms, they could go free. Leonidas's response was typically laconic. Molon Labe, come and take them. The first assault came on the 5th day. Xerxes sent his Median and Sicyon troops, good soldiers but not his best. They attacked in waves, expecting to overwhelm the Greeks through sheer numbers. But the narrow pass negated their numerical advantage. Only a few dozen men could engage at once. The Spartans had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of fighting. Standing shoulder to shoulder, their bronze-faced shields overlapping, their spears extending beyond the shield wall. This formation, the phalanx, turned them into a single organism. Each man protected not himself but the man to his left. Your shield covered your neighbor's vulnerable right side. The weight of the Spartan shield, approximately 30 pounds, would have been crushing after hours of combat. The bronze helmet restricted vision and hearing, turning the world into a narrow tunnel of violence directly ahead. Breathing became difficult in the press of bodies, the air thick with dust and the metallic smell of blood. The killing at the wall was mechanical. Thrust the spear overhand or underhand into the mass of enemies. When the spear broke, draw the short sword. When men in front fell, step forward over their bodies. No individual heroics, no breaking formation, just the steady, grinding work of killing. The Persians fell in heaps before the Spartan wall. Their wicker shields offered little protection against bronze spear points. Their shorter spears couldn't reach past the Greek shields. Wave after wave crashed against the phalanx and broke. The bodies piled so high that subsequent attackers had to climb over their own dead. The heat inside the bronze armor would have been unbearable. August in Greece, the sun beating down, engaged in constant physical exertion. Sweat would pool inside the helmet, stinging the eyes, making the leather liner slippery. Dehydration would set in quickly, but breaking formation to drink water meant death. After hours of futile assault, Xerxes sent in his immortals. These were his elite troops, 10,000 strong, called immortals because their number was always maintained. When one fell, another immediately took his place. They were professional soldiers, well-equipped, well-trained. If anyone could break the Greek line, it would be them. But the Spartans had a tactic for elite troops. They would pretend to break, turning and running in seeming panic. The immortals, sensing victory, would break formation to pursue. Then the Spartans would wheel around in perfect unison, their formation intact, and catch the Persians scattered and vulnerable. It was a maneuver that required absolute discipline. Every man had to trust that his companions would turn with him. The psychological element of this feigned retreat cannot be overstated. To turn your back on an enemy went against every instinct. To run, even as a ruse, triggered genuine panic responses that had to be controlled. Some men, even trained Spartans, would have felt their bowels loosen, their hands shake. But they ran in formation, turned in formation, killed in formation. By nightfall of the first day, the approaches to the pass were carpeted with Persian dead. Thousands had fallen. The Greeks rotated their forces, letting tired units rest while fresh ones took their place. But for the Spartans there was no real rest. They cleaned their equipment, tended their wounds, and prepared for tomorrow. The wounds themselves tell the story of this kind of combat. Deep puncture wounds from spears, difficult to clean, prone to infection. Slashing wounds from swords that laid open muscle and sinew. Broken bones from the crushing press of bodies. Concussions from strikes to the helmet. And always the smaller injuries, torn muscles, sprained joints, cuts from broken equipment. Without modern medicine, even minor wounds could prove fatal. They had no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria. Wine might be poured on wounds as a crude antiseptic. Honey, if available, could be used as a dressing, its antimicrobial properties unknown but observed. But mostly, men either healed or died according to their constitution and luck. The second day followed the pattern of the first. More waves of attackers, more mechanical slaughter. The Spartans developed a rhythm, thrust, step, their training from childhood paid dividends. While the Persians tired, the Spartans seemed inexhaustible, their bodies conditioned by decades of hardship. But they were taking losses. Not many, perhaps a few dozen over 2 days, but each fallen Spartan was irreplaceable. When a man fell, his place in the line was immediately filled, his body dragged back. There was no time for mourning, no pause to honor the dead. The line had to hold. It was probably on the evening of the second day that Ephialtes appeared, a local Greek who knew the mountains. He told Xerxes about the Anapaea path, a goat track that wound through the mountains and emerged behind the Greek position. For whatever reward he was promised, gold, land, revenge for some slight, he sold the information that would doom the defenders. Leonidas had known about the path. He'd stationed 1,000 Phocians to guard it. But when the immortals appeared on the mountain track, moving through the darkness guided by Ephialtes, the Phocians panicked. They withdrew to higher ground, assuming the Persians were coming for them specifically. The path to the Greek rear lay open. When word reached Leonidas that they'd been flanked, he faced a crucial decision. Most of the Greek allies chose to withdraw while they could. This wasn't cowardice but pragmatism. Dying for no purpose served nobody. But Leonidas and his 300 stayed, along with 700 Thespians who refused to abandon them, and 400 Thebans who may have been kept as hostages. The decision to stay requires examination. Spartan law forbade retreat, but Leonidas could have redefined the situation, a tactical withdrawal to fight another day. Some historians suggest he stayed to fulfill an oracle that said either Sparta or a Spartan king must fall. Others propose he was buying time for the rest of the army to escape. But perhaps the simplest explanation is the truest. These men were products of the agoge. They had been programmed from age 7 to stand and die rather than retreat. The very concept of strategic withdrawal may have been literally unthinkable to them. They were weapons, and weapons don't choose when to stop fighting. The final day began with Leonidas knowing they would die. According to Herodotus, he told his men to eat a good breakfast, for tonight they would dine in Hades, the gallows humor of soldiers facing certain death. They moved forward from the wall, fighting in the wider part of the pass where more of them could engage. The fighting now was different, no longer defensive but aggressive. They knew Persian reinforcements were coming from behind, so they attacked the forces in front with desperate fury. Leonidas fell relatively early, and a savage fight developed over his body. 4 times the Persians captured it, 4 times the Greeks recovered it. The spears were all broken now. They fought with swords, and when those broke, with their hands and teeth. The controlled mechanical killing of the first 2 days devolved into a melee of exhausted men grappling in the dust. The Spartans' lifetime of training still showed. They were simply better at violence than their opponents. When the immortals arrived from the rear, the remaining Greeks withdrew to a small hill behind the wall. Perhaps a few dozen Spartans were still alive, along with some Thespians. They formed a circle, facing outward. The Persians, tired of losing men, finished them with arrows. A distant, impersonal death for men who had dealt death so personally. The aftermath was typically Persian. Xerxes ordered Leonidas's head cut off and his body crucified. This was a gross violation of Greek custom, which mandated respect for the enemy dead. It showed not strength but pettiness, the act of a king frustrated by how much 300 men had cost him. The Persian losses were significant. Ancient sources claim 20,000, though this is probably exaggerated. Still, thousands certainly died, including 2 of Xerxes' brothers. More importantly, the Persian army had been delayed, their aura of invincibility shattered. The Greeks had seen that Persians died like anyone else. But let's return to those 300 Spartans and consider what their sacrifice really meant. These were men so thoroughly conditioned by their society that they literally could not conceive of acting differently. Their heroism, if we can call it that, was not a choice but a programmed response. Every single one of them had been taken from his mother at 7. had suffered through 13 years of systematic abuse designed to destroy individual thought, had been taught that the only meaningful existence was as a component of Sparta's military machine. They died at Thermopylae not for freedom. Sparta was one of the least free societies in Greece, but because they had been crafted from childhood to do exactly that. The helots who died alongside them are barely mentioned in the histories. These slaves, perhaps thousands of them, had no choice in being there. They died unnamed and unmourned, their sacrifice involuntary. Yet without them carrying supplies, tending wounds, fighting as light infantry, the 300 would have fallen on the first day. The Thespians who stayed deserve more recognition than they typically receive. Unlike the Spartans, they hadn't been programmed from birth to die on command. Their city-state didn't demand it. They chose to stay, knowing it meant death, out of genuine courage or perhaps a calculation that running would only delay the inevitable. The legacy of Thermopylae is complex. It's remembered as a triumph of courage, but it was also a failure of strategy. The pass was lost, the road to southern Greece opened. Athens would burn. Thousands would die who might have lived if the Greeks had chosen a different defensive strategy. Yet the psychological impact was undeniable. The story spread throughout Greece. 300 men had stood against the might of Persia. It became a rallying cry. When the Greeks won decisive victories at Salamis and Plataea, they fought with the memory of Thermopylae driving them. For Sparta itself, the loss of 300 full citizens was significant. Their population was already declining due to their rigid social system. Every full Spartan warrior represented a massive investment of resources and time, 20 years of training. They couldn't be quickly replaced. The mothers and wives of the 300 were expected to show no grief. This was their gift to Sparta, not just their men's lives but their own sorrow, suppressed for the good of the state. They were honored, but honor doesn't warm a bed or raise fatherless children. The Battle of Thermopylae lasted just 3 days, but its preparation took lifetimes. Every blow struck, every Persian who fell, every moment the 300 held their ground was the culmination of decades of systematic brutalization that began in childhood. The Agoge didn't create heroes. It manufactured weapons that looked like men. When news of the defeat reached Sparta, the city didn't mourn. The women who had lost husbands and sons were expected to go about their daily business without tears, without complaint. One mother, when told her son had died at his post, supposedly said only, "That is why I bore him." This wasn't strength but a kind of death in life, emotions so suppressed they ceased to exist. The narrow pass at Thermopylae is quiet now. The coastline has changed over millennia, the sea retreating, leaving the battlefield inland. Tourists come to see the monument to Leonidas, to take pictures where the 300 made their stand. But the blood has long since soaked into the earth, the bones have turned to dust, and the screams of dying men have faded into the whisper of wind through the mountains. What remains is the echo of a question that Thermopylae forces us to consider. Were these men heroes or victims? Were they defenders of freedom or products of one of history's most oppressive societies? Perhaps they were both, perhaps neither. They were certainly human beings, shaped by forces beyond their control into instruments of war, who stood where they were told to stand and died when they were expected to die. In the end, that might be the most honest thing we can say about the 300. They did exactly what Sparta had built them to do. As we leave behind the blood-soaked ground of Thermopylae, let's journey to a place where ancient Greeks sought a different kind of transformation. About 14 miles northwest of Athens, along a road that the ancients called the Sacred Way, lies the town of Eleusis. Here, for nearly 2,000 years, something extraordinary happened each autumn. something so profound that those who experienced it claimed they no longer feared death. The Eleusinian mysteries were perhaps the most famous and enduring religious rites in the ancient world. From roughly 1500 BC until 396 CE, when Christian Emperor Theodosius ordered them stopped, initiates gathered here to participate in secret ceremonies that promised to fundamentally alter their understanding of life, death, and what came after. What exactly happened during these ceremonies remained a closely guarded secret. Thousands, perhaps millions over the centuries, were initiated into the mysteries. Among them were some of the most famous names in antiquity: Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, yet none of them ever revealed the specific details of what they experienced. The penalty for revealing the secrets was death, and this wasn't an idle threat. Consider the case of Diagoras of Melos, sometimes called the first atheist. Around 415 BCE, he was accused of revealing details of the mysteries and mocking them. He fled Athens with a price on his head. Or Alcibiades, the brilliant but reckless Athenian general, accused of profaning the mysteries by performing them at a drinking party. He was sentenced to death in absentia, his property confiscated, his name cursed by priests. The fact that the secret was kept for 2 millennia is remarkable when you think about it. No civilization maintains perfect secrecy. Someone always talks, writes something down, leaves evidence. Yet the specific details of what happened in the inner sanctum at Eleusis remain unknown. We have fragments, hints, educated guesses, but the complete picture died with the last initiates. The mysteries were based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone. The story, in its basic form, is familiar. Persephone, daughter of the harvest goddess Demeter, is abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Demeter, in her grief, refuses to let anything grow, threatening humanity with starvation. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone spends part of the year underground and part above, explaining the seasons. But this was more than a fertility cult or agricultural ceremony. The initiates weren't farmers praying for good harvests. They were philosophers, generals, poets, people seeking something deeper. Aristotle wrote that those who went through the mysteries didn't learn anything specific, but experienced something, underwent a change in state of mind. The mysteries took place over 9 days. Preparation began in Athens with rituals of purification. Initiates, called mystai, would fast, bathe in the sea, sacrifice a young pig. The pig sacrifice is interesting. Pigs were associated with the underworld, with death and rebirth. Their blood was thought to purify, but also to connect the living with the realm of the dead. On the 5th day, a great procession set out from Athens to Eleusis. Thousands of people walking the sacred way, about 14 miles. They carried sacred objects in closed baskets, the contents never revealed. They stopped at various shrines along the way, performing rituals, singing hymns to Demeter and Persephone. At a bridge over the Cephisos River, something curious happened. Men with covered faces would shout insults and obscenities at the most distinguished initiates. This ritual mockery, called Jephorismus, served to humble the powerful, reminding them that in the face of the divine mysteries, all mortals were equal. Imagine wealthy aristocrats, famous generals, respected philosophers, all enduring public ridicule as part of their spiritual journey. The procession arrived at Eleusis after dark, by torchlight. The visual impact must have been extraordinary. Thousands of torches reflecting off the massive walls of the sanctuary, the shadows dancing, the smoke creating an otherworldly atmosphere. The initiates had been walking all day, fasting for longer. They were exhausted, disoriented, primed for an extraordinary experience. What happened next is where historical fact begins to blur into speculation. The initiates entered the telesterion, the great hall of initiation. This wasn't a typical temple but a massive covered space, capable of holding thousands. 42 columns supported the roof. In the center was the enactoron, the Holy of Holies, where only the Hierophant, the high priest, could enter. Before entering the telesterion, the initiates drank something called kykeon. This is where things get particularly interesting. Kykeon was described as a mixture of barley, water, and mint. But many scholars believe it contains something more, something psychoactive. The theory isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. Barley and other grains can be infected with ergot, a fungus that contains lysergic acid amides, compounds related to LSD. In controlled doses, ergot produces powerful hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, experiences of death and rebirth. Too much, and it causes convulsions, gangrene, actual death. The priests at Eleusis were essentially running the same operation for 2,000 years. They would have had plenty of time to perfect their recipe, to know exactly how much ergot-infected grain to use, how to prepare it safely. They were, in effect, the world's longest-running psychedelic therapy clinic. But ergot wasn't the only possibility. Some scholars point to the presence of poppies in Demeter's iconography, suggesting opium might have been involved. Others note that the Greeks had extensive knowledge of psychoactive plants, henbane, deadly nightshade, various mushrooms. The kykeon might have been a carefully calibrated cocktail of consciousness-altering substances. Whether or not psychedelics were involved, something profound happened in that hall. Ancient sources are consistent in describing a sequence of experiences. First came terror. Initiates spoke of overwhelming fear, confusion, wandering in darkness. This wasn't metaphorical darkness, but actual darkness. The lights in the telesterion would be extinguished. Imagine being in a massive hall with thousands of others, in complete darkness, possibly under the influence of psychoactive substances, exhausted from fasting and walking. The disorientation would be total. You would lose sense of where you were, who you were, whether you were alive or dead. Then came sounds, terrible sounds. Cries, wails, perhaps the voice of Persephone calling from the underworld. Musical instruments creating otherworldly noise. The acoustics of the telesterion were supposedly extraordinary, designed to make sounds seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. At some point, there was a dramatic revelation of light. The Hierophant would emerge from the enactoron carrying sacred objects, blazing torches would be lit, and the initiates would experience a sudden transition from darkness to light, from confusion to clarity, from death to rebirth. What exactly did the Hierophant show them? This was the ultimate secret, the thing that could never be revealed. Some ancient sources hint at things shown, things said, things performed. Was it a sacred drama, acting out Persephone's return? Was it sacred objects with profound symbolic meaning? Was it a direct divine revelation? Plutarch, who was an initiate, wrote that at the moment of death, the soul experiences something similar to what happens in the mysteries. First wandering and wearisome running about, journeys through darkness with no end in sight. Then, just before the end, terrible fear, shuddering, trembling, sweating. But then a wonderful light appears, and pure regions and meadows receive the soul. This description sounds remarkably like what modern researchers call a near-death experience. The tunnel of darkness, the being of light, the sense of peace and understanding. Were the mysteries deliberately inducing something similar through sensory deprivation, exhaustion, and possibly psychoactive substances? The Roman orator Cicero, also an initiate, said the mysteries taught how to live with joy and how to die with better hope. But he was careful never to say exactly how this teaching was accomplished. Even in his private letters, where he discussed many confidential matters, he maintained absolute silence about the specifics. The Christian writer Clement of Alexandria, writing when the mysteries were still performed but Christianity was ascending, claimed to reveal some secrets. He mentioned sacred cakes shaped like genitals, representations of divine unions, symbolic objects moved from basket to chest. But even his supposed revelations are cryptic, possibly deliberate misinformation. The social function of the mysteries extended beyond individual spiritual experience. They created a community of initiates that transcended political boundaries. Athenians and Spartans, even during wartime, would observe truces to allow safe passage for those traveling to Eleusis. The mysteries were one of the few truly pan-Hellenic institutions. Women could be initiated on equal terms with men, a rarity in Greek religion. Slaves could be initiated if their masters paid the fees. Once inside the telesterion, all were equal before the goddesses. This temporary dissolution of social hierarchy might have been one of the most radical aspects of the experience. The mysteries also served a psychological function in dealing with mortality. Ancient Greece had a generally gloomy view of the afterlife. The dead were shadows in Hades, barely conscious, eternally yearning for the life they'd lost. But initiates were promised something better, not detailed, not specific, but better. This promise wasn't based on moral behavior. You didn't earn a better afterlife by being virtuous. You earned it by undergoing the initiation, by experiencing whatever happened in the telesterion. This was a kind of spiritual technology, a procedure that, if properly administered, produced a specific result. The practical organization of the mysteries was remarkably sophisticated. The sanctuary at Eleusis was continuously expanded over centuries, eventually becoming a massive complex with multiple buildings, courtyards, and administrative facilities. The logistics of initiating thousands of people simultaneously, maintaining security, preparing the kykion, organizing the processions, all required extensive planning. The priesthood was hereditary, passed down through two families, the Eumolpidi and the Cherics. These families maintained their monopoly for 2,000 years, an astounding example of institutional continuity. They must have passed down not just ritual knowledge but practical information, recipes, dosages, psychological techniques. The economic impact was significant. Initiation fees, while not exorbitant, generated substantial revenue. Eleusis became wealthy, able to fund massive building projects. The surrounding area benefited from the annual influx of initiates who needed food, lodging, and supplies. It was religious tourism on a grand scale. The mysteries faced various challenges over the centuries. During the Peloponnesian War, Spartan forces occupied the area around Eleusis, preventing the ceremonies. The Persians destroyed the sanctuary during their invasion. The Romans initially viewed the mysteries with suspicion, though later emperors became enthusiastic initiates. The rise of Christianity ultimately doomed the mysteries. Christians saw them as demon worship, a dangerous competitor to their own promises of eternal life. When Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Eleusis in 396 CE, the sanctuary was destroyed, the priests scattered or killed, and the continuous tradition finally broken. But perhaps the mysteries didn't entirely die. Some scholars suggest their influence can be traced through various esoteric traditions: Gnosticism, Hermeticism, certain branches of Christianity. The symbolism of death and rebirth, the use of sacred meals, the progression from darkness to light. These elements appear in many later spiritual traditions. The archaeological remains at Eleusis are extensive but frustratingly uninformative about the secret rituals. We can walk through the same propylaea that initiates entered, stand in the ruins of the Telesterion, see the cave that supposedly led to the underworld, but the stones keep their silence. Modern attempts to recreate the mysteries run into fundamental problems. Even if we could determine the exact composition of the Kykion, even if we knew the precise rituals, we couldn't recreate the cultural context. The initiates brought with them a worldview where gods were real, where mysteries had power, where transformation was possible. The psychological preparation of initiates was as important as any chemical substance they might have ingested. By the time they entered the Telesterion, they had been fasting for days, exhausted from the procession, surrounded by thousands of others in the same heightened state. The boundary between individual consciousness and group experience would have begun to dissolve. Some scholars point to the architecture itself as part of the mystery. The Telesterion was unlike any other Greek temple. Instead of being designed to be viewed from outside, with the deity's statue visible through open doors, it was an enclosed space where the divine was encountered internally. The very structure suggested that what happened here was fundamentally different from ordinary religious practice. The role of music and sound cannot be underestimated. The Greeks understood the power of certain frequencies to alter consciousness. The combination of drums, cymbals, and human voices in that acoustically designed space would have created what we might now call binaural beats, sound waves that can induce trance states. Add the possible psychoactive substances, the sensory deprivation, the emotional intensity, and you have a recipe for profound altered states. There are tantalizing hints about sacred objects that were revealed. Ancient sources mention an ear of wheat, reaped in silence. This might seem mundane to us, but in the context of the ceremony, after hours of preparation, and possibly under the influence of consciousness-altering substances, a simple grain of wheat might have seemed to contain all the mysteries of life, death, and regeneration. The timing of the mysteries is significant. They took place in September at the autumn sowing. This was when seeds were placed in the dark earth, to lie dormant through winter before sprouting in spring. The parallel to human death and hoped for rebirth would have been obvious to agricultural people. But the mysteries took this natural cycle and transformed it into a personal experience. Some initiates reported seeing visions of the goddess herself. Persephone rising from the underworld, Demeter reunited with her daughter. Were these collective hallucinations, theatrical presentations enhanced by altered states, or something else entirely? The initiates themselves seem to have been uncertain, which might have been part of the power. The preparation of the Kykion would have been a closely guarded secret. If it did contain ergot or other psychoactive substances, the dosage would have been critical. Too little, and the transformative experience wouldn't occur. Too much, and initiates would become violently ill or die. The priests would have needed extensive knowledge of pharmacology, passed down through generations. Interestingly, there are accounts of people who went through the mysteries multiple times. Unlike some religious initiations that happen once, the Eleusinian mysteries could be repeated. Some people returned year after year, suggesting that whatever happened was profound enough to warrant repeated experience. Or perhaps, like many psychedelic experiences, the insights gained needed regular reinforcement. The integration of the experience was carefully managed. After the night in the Telesterion, there were additional days of ritual, sacrifices, and celebrations. This provided time for initiates to process what they had experienced before returning to ordinary life. Modern psychedelic therapy recognizes the importance of such integration, suggesting the ancient Greeks understood something about managing altered states. The mysteries also included what were called the greater and lesser mysteries. The lesser mysteries, held in spring, were a prerequisite for the greater. They involved purification rituals and preliminary teachings. This two-stage process meant that by the time someone experienced the full mysteries, they had been prepared for months, building anticipation and readiness. Political figures used initiation into the mysteries as a form of legitimacy. Roman emperors made pilgrimages to Eleusis. Augustus, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius all were initiated. It became almost a requirement for anyone claiming to be civilized and sophisticated. Yet the experience seems to have genuinely affected even these powerful, cynical men. The spread of the mysteries influenced other religious movements. The cult of Isis, which became popular throughout the Roman Empire, borrowed heavily from the Eleusinian model: secret initiation, promises of better afterlife, dramatic rituals involving death and rebirth. The Mithraic mysteries, popular among Roman soldiers, also showed similar patterns, but Eleusis remained unique. Other mystery cults proliferated, but none achieved the same combination of antiquity, prestige, and apparent efficacy. When people spoke of the mysteries without qualification, they meant Eleusis. It was the gold standard of ancient religious experience. The relationship between the mysteries and philosophy was complex. Many philosophers were initiates, but they rarely discussed the mysteries directly in their writings. Plato makes oblique references, using mystery language as metaphor for philosophical enlightenment. But did the mysteries influence his theory of forms, his ideas about the soul's immortality? We can only speculate. The mysteries might have served as a kind of therapy for existential anxiety. In a world without modern medicine, where death came frequently and suddenly, where the afterlife was imagined as a gray, joyless existence, the mysteries offered hope. Not detailed doctrine, not specific promises, but an experience that somehow made death less terrifying. Consider the testimony of Sophocles, the great tragedian who wrote so powerfully about human suffering. He called those who had been initiated thrice blessed, and said they alone had life in the underworld, while others had only evil. This from a man who spent his career contemplating the darkest aspects of human existence. The communal aspect of the experience shouldn't be overlooked. Thousands of people, from all walks of life, sharing an intense, transformative experience created bonds that transcended normal social divisions. Veterans of the mysteries recognized each other, shared a secret knowledge that couldn't be discussed but didn't need to be. The mysteries also raise questions about the nature of religious experience itself. Were the initiates experiencing genuine divine contact, accessing normally hidden dimensions of reality, or were they experiencing the power of suggestion, community, and possibly psychoactive substances to create compelling illusions? The initiates themselves might not have made such distinctions. As the centuries passed, the mysteries adapted to changing times. Under Roman rule, they became more cosmopolitan, attracting initiates from across the empire. Latin inscriptions appear alongside Greek. The ceremonies might have been modified to accommodate different cultural expectations. Yet the core secret seems to have remained intact. The end of the mysteries marked a profound shift in Western spirituality. Christianity offered its own promises of eternal life, but based on faith and moral behavior rather than direct experience. The idea that spiritual transformation could be induced through specific techniques, possibly including psychoactive substances, became heretical. The West would largely forget this approach for over 1,000 years. Modern researchers have attempted to analyze residues from vessels found at Eleusis, looking for traces of psychoactive compounds. The results have been inconclusive, which isn't surprising after 2,000 years. But the search continues, driven by a desire to understand what made the mysteries so powerful, so transformative, so worth keeping secret. The secrecy itself might have been part of the power. Modern psychology recognizes that experiences we cannot fully articulate often affect us most deeply. By forbidding initiates from discussing specifics, the mysteries ensured that each person's experience remained personal, undiminished by comparison or analysis. The ineffable remained ineffable. We do know that whatever happened in the telesterion took approximately 3 nights. The first night seems to have involved the experience of death and descent. The second, searching and wandering. The third, revelation and return. This 3-part structure appears in many transformative experiences across cultures: separation, liminal state, reintegration. The physical exhaustion of participants would have made them more susceptible to whatever techniques were employed. Sleep deprivation, fasting, intense emotion, and possibly psychoactive substances create a state where the boundaries of normal consciousness become permeable. The priests at Eleusis were masters at managing these altered states, guiding thousands safely through experiences that could easily become overwhelming. Some initiates described seeing a great light and hearing ineffable words. Others spoke of meeting the goddesses face to face. Still others reported experiencing their own death and rebirth. The variety of experiences suggests that whatever technique was used, it interacted with each individual's psychology to produce personalized revelations. The mysteries also included what were called synthema, passwords or tokens that initiates would recognize. These might have been specific phrases, gestures, or objects that served as proof of initiation. Even these have been kept secret, though some garbled versions appear in hostile Christian sources. Near the end of the ceremonies, there was something called the plemachoi, the pourings. 2 special vessels were overturned, one toward the east, one toward the west, while mystic formulas were pronounced. This ritual seems to have represented the flow of divine grace into the world, the connection between the realm of the gods and human existence. The final night involved what sources call the epoptia, the highest level of initiation. Not everyone who went through the mysteries achieved this level. It required returning a year later, undergoing additional preparation. What additional revelations the epoptia provided, we can only imagine, but those who achieved it were considered specially blessed. As dawn broke after the final night, the initiates emerged transformed. They had died and been reborn, descended to the underworld and returned, experienced the divine directly. They wore wreaths of myrtle and carried branches called bachoi. They were no longer the same people who had entered the telesterion 3 nights before. The journey back to Athens was different from the procession out. The initiates walked with a different bearing, possessed of knowledge that set them apart. They had faced the ultimate mystery, death, and found it wasn't what they had feared. This confidence, this secret knowledge, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The influence of the mysteries extended far beyond individual transformation. They represented a different model of religious experience from the public sacrifices and festivals that dominated Greek religious life. While public religion was about maintaining cosmic order and social cohesion, the mysteries were about personal transcendence. It's worth considering what was lost when the mysteries ended. For 2 millennia, Western civilization had an institution that apparently provided direct, transformative spiritual experience to anyone who could afford the modest fee. When the mysteries died, this technology of transcendence died with them. The Christian Church, which replaced the mysteries, offered its own form of salvation, but based on faith rather than experience. You believed in resurrection rather than experiencing symbolic death and rebirth. You accepted teachings about the afterlife rather than apparently visiting it yourself. The shift from experiential to doctrinal religion profoundly shaped Western culture. Today, as psychedelic therapy experiences a renaissance, as researchers explore the therapeutic potential of MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD, we might be rediscovering something the Greeks knew: that certain experiences, properly guided and integrated, can fundamentally alter how we relate to existence, mortality, and meaning, but we'll never know exactly what happened in the Telesterion. The last initiate took that secret to their grave 1600 years ago. The broken stones of Eleusis offer no answers. The sacred objects, whatever they were, have long since crumbled to dust. The recipe for Kykeon, if it was indeed psychoactive, is lost. What remains are the testimonies of those who experienced it. Their consistent reports that after the mysteries, death held no terror, that they had seen something that made ordinary life seem like shadow, that they possessed knowledge that couldn't be spoken but transformed everything. Perhaps that's the ultimate mystery of the mysteries. Not what specifically happened in that torchlit hall, but how an experience could be so powerful that thousands kept it secret for 2,000 years. How it could offer something that made philosophers, emperors, and ordinary citizens all claim that their lives had been fundamentally changed. The sacred way from Athens to Eleusis is now a modern highway, lined with industrial buildings and shopping centers. The sanctuary itself is an archaeological site, visited by tourists who snap photos among the ruins. But on certain autumn evenings, when the light fades and shadows lengthen among the broken columns, you might almost imagine you hear something. The distant echo of hymns, the whisper of ancient secrets, the footsteps of initiates walking toward a mystery we can no longer fathom. In the end, the Eleusinian mysteries remind us that the ancient Greeks, for all their rationality and philosophy, understood something about human consciousness that we're only beginning to rediscover. They knew that certain experiences could reshape the psyche, that death could be rehearsed and thereby defanged, that the divine, however we define it, could be encountered directly rather than simply believed in. The silence of the initiates speaks louder than any revelation. Whatever they experienced was so far beyond ordinary language that to speak of it would be to diminish it. And so they kept their secret, age after age, until the last initiate died and the mystery became truly mysterious, leaving us to wonder, to speculate, and perhaps to search for our own ways to touch whatever truth they found in that torchlit hall so long ago. As twilight descends over Athens, let's ascend from the crowded streets and cramped dwellings we've explored, climbing the slopes toward the wealthy district where houses spread out like small estates, where private wells provide clean water, where the smoke from cooking fires is carried away by proper chimneys. Here, in a spacious home with a central courtyard blooming with imported flowers, Pericles is preparing to host a symposium. The year is perhaps 440 BCE, the height of Athens' golden age. Pericles has been the dominant political figure for over 2 decades, guiding the democracy while living a life that would seem impossibly aristocratic to the common citizens who vote for him. This evening, he'll entertain a select group of friends, philosophers, poets, politicians, in the highly ritualized drinking party that serves as the elite's primary social institution. The symposium was far more than just a party. It was where real power in Athens was exercised, where political alliances were forged, where cultural values were shaped. While the assembly might vote on proposals, those proposals were often crafted in rooms like this, among men reclining on cushioned couches, drinking carefully watered wine, and engaging in the kind of sophisticated discussion that required leisure, education, and freedom from manual labor. The room itself, the andron or men's room, has been specially designed for these gatherings. Square in shape, with couches arranged around the walls, it accommodates precisely the right number of guests. Usually between 14 and 30 men, never more than could maintain a single conversation. The floors are waterproof, sloped toward drains, because these parties would get messy as the night wore on. The walls are painted with scenes from mythology, perhaps Dionysus in triumph, satyrs pursuing nymphs, heroes at feast. These aren't crude decorations but sophisticated artworks, commissioned from renowned painters. The cost of decorating this single room would exceed what a common laborer might earn in several years. As guests begin arriving, we see the careful choreography of elite social interaction. Each man is greeted by name, his accomplishments acknowledged, his recent victories in court or assembly celebrated. These greetings aren't spontaneous but calculated, reinforcing hierarchies and alliances that will shape Athenian policy. The guest list itself tells a story of power and exclusion. Here's Anaxagoras, the philosopher who claims the sun is a hot stone rather than a god. Phidias, the sculptor whose works adorn the Acropolis. Sophocles, already famous for his tragedies. Perhaps Aspasia, Pericles' companion, though as a woman and a foreigner, her presence would be scandalous. Aspasia deserves special attention. A Hetaira, or educated courtesan, from Miletus, she's Pericles' intellectual equal, perhaps his superior. She runs a school of rhetoric, influences his speeches, discusses philosophy with Socrates, yet she cannot be his legal wife, cannot own property in Athens, exists in a legal twilight that highlights the contradictions of Athenian society. The other women present, if any, would also be hetaira. These weren't common prostitutes, but educated companions who could contribute to philosophical discussions, play music, recite poetry. They occupied a strange position, more free than citizen wives who were locked in their homes, yet forever excluded from respectability. Citizen wives, including Pericles' former wife, whom he divorced to live with Aspasia, would never attend such gatherings. They remain in the women's quarters, managing households they rarely leave, their virtue measured by their invisibility. The same men who debate democracy and freedom keep their wives in conditions that approach imprisonment. As the guests recline on their couches, two to a couch, an arrangement that encourages intimate conversation, slaves begin the elaborate service that will continue through the night. These aren't the broken figures from the silver mines, but specialized domestic slaves, some worth more than a small house. The wine steward, the food taster, the musicians, each represents a significant investment. The meal begins with offerings to the gods. Wine is poured on the floor, prayers are spoken, tradition is observed. But there's a perfunctory quality to these rituals among this sophisticated crowd. Some, like Anaxagoras, barely hide their skepticism about the god's existence. Yet they go through the motions because open atheism remains dangerous. The food served bears no resemblance to the barley gruel and olives that sustain most Athenians. Here are delicacies imported from across the Mediterranean, fish from the Black Sea packed in salt, cheese from Sicily, honey from Mount Hymettus, wines from Chios and Lesbos, each with distinct flavors that the guests discuss with the seriousness of modern sommeliers. The preparation of these dishes represents hours of slave labor. In the kitchen, which the guests will never see, slaves have been working since dawn, grinding spices in mortars, tending fires at exactly the right temperature, arranging food on silver platters with artistic precision. A single mistake might earn a beating. The symposiarch, the master of ceremonies chosen for the evening, decides the ratio of wine to water. This is a crucial decision. Too strong and the evening descends into chaos. Too weak and the conversation lacks sparkle. The standard ratio is 3 parts water to 1 part wine, but sophisticated gatherings might adjust this as the evening progresses. The mixing bowl, the crater, sits in the center of the room. It's not just functional but a work of art, painted with scenes that might inspire conversation. Perhaps it shows Achilles and Ajax playing dice, or Odysseus escaping the Cyclops. These vessels, created by master craftsmen, cost more than a common worker's annual income. The cups, too, are carefully chosen. Shallow bowls called kylixes, painted with scenes that are revealed as the wine is drunk. Some show erotic scenes that would become visible just as the wine begins to affect judgment. Others display philosophical maxims or political satire. Each cup is a conversation piece, a status symbol, a work of art. The conversation begins with light topics. Recent performances in the theater, gossip from the agora, the latest fashions from Corinth or Syracuse. But gradually, guided by the symposiarch, it turns to weightier matters. The nature of justice, the best form of government, the existence of the gods, the meaning of beauty. These discussions follow certain rules. Arguments must be logical. References to poets and philosophers are expected. Emotional outbursts are considered barbaric. It's a performance as much as a conversation, each man displaying his education, his wit, his sophistication. A particularly clever argument or apt quotation will be remembered and repeated throughout Athens. Pericles himself is a master of this kind of discourse. His voice is said to be so compelling that people call him the Olympian for his ability to thunder like Zeus. He speaks of democracy while living like an aristocrat, of equality while served by slaves, of justice while his building projects impoverish allied cities forced to pay tribute. The hypocrisy is breathtaking but unexamined. These men genuinely believe they're creating a more just society while depending entirely on the labor of those excluded from it. They praise poverty as philosophically virtuous while ensuring they never experience it. They speak of freedom while owning human beings. As the evening progresses and the wine takes effect, the entertainment begins. Musicians, usually slaves or hired foreigners, play the aulos, a double-piped instrument that produces a haunting, penetrating sound. The music is sophisticated, with complex modes that supposedly affect the listener's emotions in specific ways. Sometimes there are dancers, young men or hetaira, who perform in ways that would shock the modest citizens outside. These performances can be athletic, erotic, or both. The boundary between art and prostitution is deliberately blurred. The guests watch with the detached appreciation of connoisseurs. The game of katabos becomes popular as inhibitions lower. Players flick the dregs of their wine at targets, competing for prizes. It requires skill and produces much laughter, but also reinforces social hierarchies. Who throws at whom, who wins, who loses gracefully, all carry social meaning. Poetry recitation is expected. Guests take turns singing or reciting, sometimes composing verses on the spot. The ability to quote Homer appropriately, to compose an elegant epigram, to cap someone else's verse with something cleverer. These skills matter as much as political acumen. The poetry often contains coded political messages. A verse praising ancient heroes might be a critique of current leaders. A hymn to the gods might mock religious conservatives. These educated men communicate in layers of meaning that would be lost on the common citizens they claim to represent. Political plotting happens in euphemisms and allusions. Wouldn't it be beneficial if one might consider? A wise man would perhaps. Careers are advanced or destroyed, policies are crafted, alliances are formed, all while maintaining the pretense that this is merely friendly conversation. The slaves serving wine hear everything but are considered as animate furniture, no more capable of understanding or repeating what they hear than the couches themselves. This assumption is dangerous. Some slaves are highly educated war captives who understand every nuance. Information learned at symposia sometimes finds its way to political enemies. As midnight approaches, the serious conversation might give way to more dissolute activities. The hetaira might move from intellectual companions to sexual partners. Inhibitions dissolved by wine lead to behaviors that would be scandalous in daylight. What happens at the symposium supposedly stays at the symposium, though gossip always escapes. Some symposia devolve into komoi, drunken processions through the streets. The participants, wreathed with flowers and carrying torches, sing bawdy songs and pound on the doors of lovers or enemies. These raids by the elite on public peace are tolerated because who would dare prosecute Pericles' drinking companions? But tonight, perhaps, Pericles maintains more decorum. He has a reputation to protect, a city to run. As the host, he must ensure his guests leave safely, their slaves summoned to guide them home through dark streets. He must remember who said what, who allied with whom, what policies gained support. The cost of this single evening would support a common family for months. The wine alone represents a significant expense, imported and properly aged. The food, the musicians, the olive oil for the lamps that burn late into the night. All of it demonstrates the vast gulf between the elite and everyone else. Yet these same men will stand in the assembly tomorrow and speak of equality. They'll propose policies that affect thousands of lives they can barely imagine. They'll send men to die in wars discussed over wine. They'll vote on public works paid for by tribute extracted from subject cities. The symposium represents everything admirable and everything corrupt about Athenian democracy. Here, human intellect reaches unprecedented heights. Philosophical concepts are born that will shape thought for millennia. But it's all built on a foundation of exclusion, exploitation, and hypocrisy. Consider the sheer privilege of having time for such gatherings. While most Athenians collapse exhausted after 12 hours of physical labor, these men have leisure for 6-hour drinking parties. They can afford to be hung over tomorrow because they don't work with their hands. Their wealth, inherited or extracted from others' labor, purchases time, the ultimate luxury. The intellectual achievements of these symposia cannot be denied. Many of Plato's dialogues are set at such gatherings, suggesting this is where serious philosophy was actually practiced. The symposium itself, discussing the nature of love, captures both the brilliance and the exclusivity of these occasions. Ideas that would transform human thought emerged from rooms that most humans could never enter. The medical knowledge displayed at these gatherings was sophisticated for its time. Guests discussed the theories of Hippocrates, debated the four humors, prescribed treatments that at least attempted systematic observation. Yet this knowledge remained largely theoretical for them. When they fell ill, they had access to the best physicians. When common citizens sickened, they relied on prayers and folk remedies. The wine continues flowing as the night deepens. Some guests have already succumbed, lying unconscious on their couches while the conversation continues around them. This isn't considered shameful. The ability to drink to excess is almost expected. Slaves stand ready with buckets for those who need to vomit. a normal part of the evening's progression. The art of conversation at these gatherings followed strict protocols. You couldn't simply launch into a topic. There were elaborate preliminaries, quotes from poets to set the tone, references to previous discussions. A man who spoke too bluntly or too soon marked himself as unsophisticated. The elite communicated as much through what they didn't say as what they did. Consider the complexity of maintaining your position in this world. Every word weighed for its political implications. Every gesture observed for signs of alliance or enmity. Every joke analyzed for hidden meanings. The mental exhaustion of navigating these waters might explain why some elite men sought oblivion in wine. The slaves, meanwhile, maintain their invisible presence. They anticipate needs before they're expressed, refill cups without being asked, clean up spills without drawing attention. Their training for such service began in childhood, often involving brutal punishments for the slightest error. A slave who performed perfectly at a symposium might be rewarded with extra food or a slightly better sleeping spot. One who failed might be sold to the mines. Some of these slaves were once free citizens of conquered cities. Perhaps that man pouring wine was once a merchant in Melos before Athens destroyed the city, killed the men, and enslaved the women and children. He might have hosted his own symposia, discussed philosophy, owned slaves himself. Now he exists as property, his humanity legally erased. The question of slavery occasionally surfaces in the philosophical discussions. Some sophists argue that slavery is merely conventional, not natural, but even they don't seriously propose abolition. The entire structure of their leisured existence depends on unfree labor. To question slavery too deeply would be to question everything. As the night wears on, the discussion might turn to democracy itself. These wealthy men have complex relationships with the system. They benefit from it when they can manipulate it, suffer from it when the masses turn against them. They speak of the tyranny of the majority, while working constantly to maintain their own dominance. Pericles himself embodies these contradictions. He's an aristocrat who leads the democratic faction. He expands voting rights while ensuring real power remains with those who have time for politics, the wealthy. He speaks of Athens as a school for all Greece while extracting tribute that impoverishes other cities. The building projects that Pericles champions, the Parthenon, the Propylaea, the other monuments that will define classical architecture, are discussed here first. The guests debate aesthetic choices, construction techniques, which sculptors to commission. Decisions that will shape how humanity thinks about beauty are made between cups of wine. But these projects are funded by tribute from the Delian League, supposedly collected for mutual defense against Persia. Pericles has diverted this money to glorify Athens. When allied cities protest, Athens sends warships. The beautiful temples that tourists will admire for millennia are built on exploitation and enforced at sword point. The conversation might drift to the theater, another elite preoccupation disguised as public benefit. The great tragedies performed at the Dionysia are funded by wealthy citizens as a form of taxation. But the themes they explore, fate, justice, the nature of power, are precisely the concerns of men like these. The common citizens watching might enjoy the spectacle, but the real audience is here in this room. Women, when discussed at all, are categorized with casual misogyny. Wives are for producing legitimate heirs, hetaira for pleasure and conversation, slaves for everything else. The idea that women might have their own desires, their own intellectual capabilities, their own rights, is literally unthinkable to most of these men. Even Pericles, who clearly respects Aspasia's intelligence, cannot imagine a world where she would be his legal equal. The children of these men are being raised to replicate this system. Sons are already learning to see themselves as naturally superior, attending gymnasium where they'll form the networks that will sustain their privilege. The boys who serve at symposia, playing the lyre and enduring various forms of exploitation, are receiving their own education in power and submission. They learn that access to influence requires accepting degradation, that advancement comes through pleasing those above you. The game of katabos begins as inhibitions lower further. Men fling wine dregs at targets, competing for trivial prizes with intense focus. But even this drunken game reinforces hierarchies. Who throws at whom, who wins gracefully, who sulks at losing. Every interaction, even in play, carries political weight. Around 3 in the morning, the symposium begins to wind down. Some guests have passed out. Others are still arguing philosophical points with the intense focus that only the deeply intoxicated can maintain. Pericles, ever the consummate host, remains relatively sober, noting who has said what, who has revealed weaknesses, who might be useful allies. The political bonds formed here will shape tomorrow's assembly. When these men, still nursing their hangovers, stand before the citizen body to propose laws or argue for war, they'll be enacting agreements made over wine. The democratic assembly, that great innovation of Athenian politics, often merely ratifies what was decided in rooms like this. The slaves begin the long process of cleaning up. Wine must be mopped from floors, vomit cleaned from cushions, broken pottery swept away. The decorated kylixes that revealed erotic scenes as wine was drunk must be washed. The crater that held the sacred mixture of wine and water must be cleaned. They work in exhausted silence, knowing that tomorrow, already today, they must prepare for the household's normal operations. As dawn approaches, the last conscious guests are helped to their litters or supported by their slaves for the journey home. They'll sleep through the morning, perhaps appear in the agora by afternoon, suffer through assembly meetings with pounding heads. The decisions they make while hung over will affect thousands of lives. The contrast with common Athenians, already rising to begin another day of labor, could not be starker. While Pericles sleeps off his symposium, construction workers are climbing scaffolding on the Acropolis. While philosophers nurse headaches, potters are lighting their kilns. While politicians dream wine-soaked dreams, farmers are walking miles to their fields. This is the reality of the Athenian Golden Age. Extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievements emerging from a society built on systematic exploitation. Democracy for the few sustained by the labor of the many. Beauty and wisdom flowering in gardens walled off from those who make such gardens possible. The symposium as an institution would outlast Athenian democracy. Romans would adopt and adapt it, medieval monasteries would echo some of its intellectual traditions, Renaissance humanists would try to recreate it. The ideal of educated men discussing eternal questions over wine has never entirely disappeared from Western culture. But we should remember what made such gatherings possible. The slaves who served the wine, the wives locked in their quarters, the common citizens whose labor created the surplus that funded leisure, the subject cities whose tribute paid for the buildings where symposia were held. Every philosophical insight, every beautiful poem, every brilliant political theory emerged from a context of inequality so profound that those who benefited from it couldn't even see it. As the morning sun illuminates Athens, Pericles' house falls quiet. The great man sleeps, perhaps dreaming of the speech he'll give in the assembly, the monument he'll commission, the war he'll advocate. In a few hours he'll wake, bathe with water carried by slaves, eat food prepared by slaves, dress in clothes woven by women who have no choice. Then he'll walk to the agora, that great democratic space, and speak of freedom, equality, and justice. He'll be brilliant, persuasive, visionary. He'll shape policies that will echo through history. And he'll do it all without ever acknowledging the fundamental contradictions that make his brilliance possible. And so, friends, our journey through ancient Greece draws to a close. We've walked the cramped streets of Athens at dawn, stood with the Spartans at Thermopylae's narrow pass, glimpsed the sacred mysteries at Eleusis, and reclined at an elite symposium as wine and words flowed in equal measure. What we've discovered is a world both brilliant and brutal, where philosophy was born in rooms slaves could never enter, where democracy flourished for the few while the many labored in silence, where the monuments we admire today were built on foundations of human suffering we can barely imagine. Think of that ordinary Athenian we met this morning, waking on his hard pallet, gnawing his barley bread, navigating streets without sewers, working until exhaustion claimed him. His life, multiplied by thousands, tens of thousands, made possible the golden age we celebrate. Every marble statue, every philosophical dialogue, every tragic play was purchased with uncounted hours of unrecorded labor. The Spartans we encountered, those legendary warriors, were weapons forged from childhood trauma. The agoge that created them was systematic child abuse dressed as education. They died at Thermopylae not as free men choosing heroism, but as programmed instruments fulfilling their design. Their courage was real, but it was courage without choice, valor without freedom. The mysteries at Eleusis offered something extraordinary: direct spiritual experience, transformation, the promise that death was not the end. But even this transcendence was exclusive, available only to those who could afford the fees, make the journey, take time from survival. The slaves who built the telesterion, who prepared the sacred Kykion, who cleaned up after the initiates, they lived and died without ever knowing what secrets those walls contained. And those sophisticated symposia, where wine and wisdom mingled, they gave us Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's theories, the intellectual foundations of Western thought. But they were built on the exclusion of women, the exploitation of slaves, the extraction of wealth from subject cities. Every brilliant idea was subsidized by someone else's oppression. This was ancient Greece, not the clean marble paradise of our imagination, but a complex, contradictory civilization where extraordinary achievements and everyday brutality existed side by side. Where a tiny elite had the leisure to invent philosophy while most people struggled simply to survive another day. As you lie in your bed tonight, with its soft mattress and clean sheets, with water that flows from taps, food refrigerated and safe, with antibiotics for illness and laws that generally protect rather than exploit, remember the ordinary Greeks whose names history never recorded. Remember the potter breathing clay dust that would destroy his lungs, the construction worker hauling marble blocks under the killing sun, the wife confined to her quarters, brilliant mind wasted on domestic tedium, the slave in the silver mines, counting days until death released him. They were there, in every monument we admire, every text we study, every idea we celebrate. Their unrecorded lives made the recorded ones possible. Their forgotten suffering purchased the remembered glory. The ancient Greeks gave us democracy, but it was democracy for the few. They gave us philosophy, but it was philosophy built on leisure stolen from others' labor. They gave us art and architecture that still takes our breath away, but every beautiful thing was paid for in ugliness we've chosen to forget. Perhaps that's the real lesson of ancient Greece, not the mythology of rational Athens or heroic Sparta, but the reality of human civilizations in all their complexity. Great achievements built on great injustices, beauty flowering from brutality, wisdom emerging from societies that were, in many ways, profoundly unwise. The past wasn't golden. It was hard and cruel, and for most people, desperately difficult. Whatever struggles we face in our modern world, and they are real, they are serious, we should remember that we wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece, not because we're weak, but because that world was hostile to human flourishing in ways we can barely comprehend. So as sleep begins to claim you, as your breathing slows and your mind drifts, be grateful for this moment, for the soft darkness of your room instead of the smoke-filled dwellings of Athens, for the peace that lets you rest without fear of plague or invasion, for the medicine that keeps you alive past 35, for the freedom to think, to speak, to be, in ways the ancient Greeks could never imagine. The marble ruins stand silent now. Tourists photograph them, scholars study them, dreamers imagine the lives lived among them. But the true story of ancient Greece isn't in the monuments. It's in the dust beneath them, where countless ordinary people lived and died, suffered and endured, making possible a legacy they would never share. Their voices are lost, their names forgotten, their stories untold. But they were there, in every column of the Parthenon, every line of Homer, every word of Plato, the invisible thousands who held up the visible few, the forgotten humans who paid the price for remembered humanity. Sleep now, friends, let the ancient world fade back into the past where it belongs. Tomorrow you'll wake to running water and electric light, to rites the Greeks couldn't conceive and comforts they couldn't dream. You'll live a life that would seem magical to them, miraculous, impossible, and perhaps, in your dreams, you might spare a thought for all those whose names we'll never know, whose lives we can only imagine, who endured so much with so little for so long. They were people like us, with the same hopes, the same fears, the same need for dignity and meaning. They just had the misfortune to be born 2,500 years too soon. The past is a foreign country, and ancient Greece, for all its familiarity, for all its influence on our world, was more foreign than we like to admit. It was a place where brilliance and brutality walked hand in hand, where democracy and slavery coexisted without contradiction, where the life of the mind was built on the breaking of bodies. Rest well, knowing you live in better times. Not perfect times, but better. Times when more people have more freedom, more comfort, more possibility than ever before in human history. The struggles continue, the injustices persist, but we've come so far from those desperate streets of ancient Athens. So close your eyes, let your mind quiet, let the centuries roll backward and forward like waves on an ancient shore. You've traveled far tonight, through time and space, through triumph and tragedy. Now it's time to return to the present, to the safety of your own bed, your own time, your own life. Good night, friends. May your dreams be gentler than history. May your sleep be deeper than the shadows of the past. And may you wake tomorrow grateful for this moment, this place, this time in which we're fortunate enough to live. The ancient Greeks are gone. Their voices stilled, their struggles ended, their stories told. But we remain, inheritors of their achievements, students of their mistakes, beneficiaries of their suffering. We carry them forward, the named and the nameless alike, into whatever future we're capable of building. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all we can do. Remember them honestly, learn from them fully, and try, in our own imperfect way, to build something better on the foundations they laid, something more just, more inclusive, more humane. Sleep now. The past is past. The present is yours. And tomorrow is always another beginning.